And yes, I include Miami in tier 1. A lot of people might push back on that. Well, Miami can make the playoff, but can they win the national championship? I am a believer. Hello and welcome in. It's always college football. I'm your host, Greg McElroy, and we appreciate you being with us from wherever it is you're coming to us from, whether that's via the ESPN YouTube channel. Subscribe to that. Comment on that. We're going to start getting a little more involved from a comment standpoint on there. So if you want to interact with us, interact with the show, you can do so on the ESPN College Football YouTube page. You can also check us out on our podcast platform. Just search Always College Football, whatever podcast platform you use. You can subscribe. Please, if you could, leave a rating, leave a review, whatever you want. But the subscription is paramount. We greatly appreciate those of you that have already done that so far this year. Numbers are up tremendously, especially in an offseason when it's been a little quiet, frankly, compared to what we've had the last couple of years with realignment, new playoff, new teams in different places, new coaches retiring, what have you. It's been kind of a slow offseason, and yet the numbers are up massively. So we greatly appreciate the support you've shown the show. Continue to tell your friends that we are trying to cover the sport the best way we know how by just covering it in like kind of a black and white way, man. We like this. We don't like this. That's the way it goes. So we have a great show for you today. We've done our tiers in the Big 12. We've done our tiers in the SEC. Well, as we bring ACC Media Days to a close, we feel like it's appropriate to do the ACC tiers. And then, of course, next week, we'll get to the Big 10 tiers. But today is for the ACC. We're going to go through how many national championship contenders, how many playoff contenders, how many teams are bowl bound, how many teams are spoilers, and how many teams have work to do. It's a great league, an exciting league top to bottom, and one that has a lot of intrigue heading into 2025. So let's kick things off with tier 1. The national championship contenders from the ACC. We will start with the team that should be ranked top 2, top 3, at worst top 4 in college football heading into the season, and that is the Clemson Tigers. Look, the expectations are sky high. Feels like 2025 has been the year that they've circled for quite some time. They have veterans in pivotal places. They've even gone to the portal in a couple spots to reinforce some places that had some depth issues from a year ago. It all starts, though, with Cade Klubnik. Great year in 2024 after what was kind of a learning curve year in 23. Feels like he's poised to take the next step. I think you can make a strong argument that he's the best quarterback returning in college football. He also won't have to do it himself. They have tremendous talent at wide receiver: Antonio Williams, Bryant Wesco, TJ Moore, handful of others that can all contribute and play at a really high level. And then defensively, you got to love what they have back along the defensive line and how they've reinforced that position with a couple of pivotal, impactful transfers. So let's start with a couple of the questions. Running back, I believe, is a bit of a question, but they go out and they add Gideon Davidson, who was one of the highest rated freshman running back recruits in the entire country. And we've seen in the past already, Clemson rely on freshman running backs, and they ultimately go on and have great success early in their careers. ETN comes to mind. Will Shipley comes to mind. Phil Maffa got plenty of action as a young player as well. So running back is one position that I am pretty curious about, but I'm optimistic about that group in total because of how good they should be along the offensive line. That should be a position of strength, and how good they should be in the passing attack with a veteran quarterback and outstanding wide receivers. I look at the defense. The defense in the front 7 should be outstanding. It's been really good for a long time. It should come as no surprise. But if you look at Peter Woods, he's probably going to be sliding back to a more natural position at defensive tackle. I look at what they have back at defensive end. That was a position last year where they struggled a little bit. I'm not saying struggled significantly, but they struggled a little bit because they just didn't have depth. So when TJ Parker, their outstanding defensive end, went off the field, he finished last year with 11 sacks, nearly 20 tackles for loss. When he was off the field, there was a pretty considerable drop to the backups. And for TJ Parker, you can't play 65 snaps a game. It's just too many. So I think they're more equipped to handle the challenges of getting through their season unscathed. I also like the transfer of Jeremiah Alexander at linebacker. I like Will Height, who's going to be there on the edge to kind of offset the attention that TJ Parker will likely get. And I absolutely love the defensive coordinator hire of Tom Allen. Tom Allen was at Penn State last year. He's aggressive. He's disciplined. They can do a lot of different things. And I do think the guys, when you watch Tom Allen in the past, everywhere he's been, whether it was at Indiana, at Penn State, even as a coordinator prior to becoming a head coach, the guys always played outrageously hard for him. I think Clemson has as many known commodities on their roster as anyone in college football. Penn State might have a few more superstar pieces, but I don't think Clemson takes a backseat to very many. They have everything you could possibly want to make a national championship run. And then you look at the schedule, LSU at home, very difficult. That'll be week 1. Tough game. We'll get a great sense of where those two teams are. They're in week number 1. They'll go to South Carolina. They'll bookend the regular season with 2 very difficult games against SEC opponents. They'll get Florida State at home. They'll get SMU at home. They go to Louisville. They also have Georgia Tech on the road as well. So there are some possible hurdles that Clemson will have to overcome. But all things considered, man, I'd be surprised if we fast forward to the end of the season and this team isn't at least in the ACC championship game and in strong position to get one of those top 4 seeds in the college football playoff. Moving next to the Miami Hurricanes, and yes, I include Miami in tier 1. A lot of people might push back on that. Well, Miami can make the playoff, but can they win the national championship? I am a believer. I look at where this team has gone the last couple of years, where they've progressed the last couple of years, and I happen to think this could be maybe the best year in Mario Cristobal's tenure up to this point. A lot of people wondering about Carson Beck, but I remember calling Carson Beck's first game last year against Clemson, and he was at that time the Heisman frontrunner. He was at that time one of the faces of college football, and he was likely to be, if he were to have left the year before to become an NFL draft pick, he would have been in the top 5 in the NFL draft. A guy who was really, really well respected. Now, it didn't work out so well for him last year, and they had to kind of rely a little bit too much on his arm. It took too much out of the run game. The offensive line was inconsistent. The wide receivers at Georgia were inconsistent. But Carson Beck, I think, got way too much heat for what went down at Georgia last year. Yes, he's coming off an injury. He hurt that elbow in the SEC championship game, but all signs point to him being at 100% when they kick things off here in fall camp here very, very soon. But the strength of Miami's team will always be along the offensive and defensive lines. Mario Cristobal has talked about this over and over and over again. He believes that the strength of the team will always be found in the trenches. It's fundamental to his belief system. They're going to be deep. They're going to be talented along the offensive line. They have outstanding pieces at tackle. They've fortified the interior. And then on the defensive side, man, they are really, really solid with a couple of the big time playmakers like Reuben Bain who can take over the game at any given point. You also look, too, at the wide receiver core from last year. That was a group that was occasionally up and down. For the most part, they were pretty good. But this group has a chance to take a big step forward in the passing attack. And then defensively, that's where most of their concerns were had last year. They decided to go out, get a new defensive coordinator. Corey Heatherman comes down from Minnesota, where they're going to be very, very sound. It's not going to be quite as aggressive as what they had last year. They're going to allow just the talent on the roster to come to the forefront. They're not going to try to out-scheme you. They're not going to try to trick you. They're just going to play good, sound defense. Hopefully this will improve tackling, and hopefully this will stop giving up as many explosive plays as they gave up last year. I love the additions that they've made in the portal. I love the pieces that they bring back. And I also love how kind of the schedule sets up. They get some really good challenges, but they are at home. They'll have Notre Dame at home. That's week 1. Massive game there on Sunday night. You get Florida at home. I'm a believer in the Gators this year. I think they're going to be much better than they were a year ago. That game will be in the friendly confines of Hard Rock Stadium as well. They go to Florida State. They get Louisville at home. They go to SMU. They also are at Virginia Tech. They're at Pittsburgh. The big thing with Miami is don't lose to teams that you should beat. That's been a little bit of a problem the last 2 years. They kind of elevate their play at times, and they have at times played down to the level of the competition. A road trip to Pittsburgh, a road trip to Virginia Tech. Those are games where they can't stumble. And if they can just play up to their potential on a week-to-week basis, you got to feel really confident about what Miami might be able to do here in 25. Moving on to Tier 2, and these are teams that I don't believe can win the national championship, but they can absolutely make a run at the college football playoff, and we'll kick things off with the Louisville Cardinals. Now, They had a really solid season last year. Jeff Brom does an amazing job. I don't think anybody's going to push back on that. I like the addition of Miller Moss. Now, you look at what they had last year in Tyler Shuck, he was outstanding, was rewarded with a second-round pick from the New Orleans Saints and is likely to be a day one starter for the Saints here this season. But Miller Moss at times, big key there, at times has been very, very solid. There have been flashes of brilliance from Miller Moss, best exemplified by what he did in the 2023 Holiday Bowl, where he threw 6 touchdowns. This is an offensive system that is geared towards the quarterback. The good news is they don't have to put it all on Miller Moss's shoulders. This is an exceptionally good running back duo. You might have one of the best running back tandems in the entire country. Isaac Brown was the ACC Rookie of the Year last year, went for over 1,100 yards, 11 touchdowns. He's widely considered one of the best backs in all of college football. And you also have Duke Watson, who I think can take some of the load off from time to time. This is a great 1-2 punch, and the offense should be centered around how often those guys are getting touches and how good they're going to be running the football. The defense was kind of the biggest question mark. Look, you look at what they have back at the linebacker spot, they should be pretty good. You also look, too, at what they've done from a transfer portal standpoint. Looks like things should be pretty good there on the defensive side. So you look back end, that's the big concern. I think Louisville secondary, especially at corner, they've lost several impactful defensive backs to graduation into the transfer portal. So you got to rebuild that unit, but they feel pretty confident based on what they have. Also really bullish on what they have at wide receiver. Chris Bell, Colin Lacey. This should be a really good offense across the board. It's just, can they get back to playing high-level defense like they did a couple years ago and route to a possible college football playoff berth? This is a very difficult schedule in the ACC. They'll get Clemson, they go to Miami, they go to SMU, they go to Virginia Tech, they go to Pitt. Those are very, very difficult games with 4 of the aforementioned 5 on the road. You also get James Madison, who, while not in the Power 4, we have seen James Madison elevate at times against top-level competition. They beat North Carolina last year and hung 70 points in the performance. They also get Kentucky at home. There's some more manageable games on the roster, too, with BC, Virginia, Bowling Green, Eastern Kentucky, California. They get some manageable games in there as well, but it's a very, very difficult schedule. And if they could somehow get through that 5-game stretch with those 4 road games and Clemson at home, they can get through that stretch at 3-2. That'd be pretty remarkable. I'm not sure they can, but they certainly have the potential, if they can improve defensively, to be in the mix and make every single one of those games highly competitive. The Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets are also in tier number 2. Now, a lot of positive momentum has been created under third-year head coach Brent Key. And I think most of the college football world, they watched that game last year against Georgia, and they came away from that game in the final game of the regular season with a newfound respect for what Georgia Tech might be capable of. Look, it all centers around Haynes King. He's been around for a really long time. All right, he led the ACC in completion percentage. He had nearly 600 rushing yards. He was banged up throughout the season last year, so it's going to be paramount for him to stay healthy. But that 1-2 punch with Haynes King at quarterback and Jamal Haynes at running back, who had over 1,000 yards last year, is massive. They should also have one of the stronger offensive lines in the ACC. And while they lost Eric Singleton in the transfer portal to Auburn, they go into the portal, add Eric Rivers, who had a tremendous year last year at over 1,100 yards and 12 touchdowns for FIU, and a couple other young, promising receivers that they feel really good about. They do need to take a couple strides on defense, but they have a very experienced secondary. They have a new defensive coordinator in Blake Gideon, who they're very optimistic about. He comes over from Texas, and they have made a lot of additions via the transfer portal. Look, Brent Key is going to be a tough coach. This team will be physical. This team will have a chip on their shoulder, and they will absolutely grind on every single team they play. It's just, will they be able to win the games against the best teams that the ACC has to offer? Look, we know that they get Georgia in the non-conference. That'll be the final game of the regular season in clean, old-fashioned hate. That game's going to be in Mercedes-Benz Stadium, so Georgia very familiar with the terrain, so a, quote, neutral site game will be interesting there at season's end. They host Clemson. They go to Colorado. That's week 1. That'll be a high-profile opportunity for Georgia Tech to kind of showcase their advancements this year against a team in Colorado that has a lot of new pieces that will be filling in. They also go to NC State, who we'll talk about in a bit. I think NC State's got a chance to be a bit of a sleeper. They'll get Virginia Tech at home. They'll get Syracuse at home. But the schedule is not impossible for Georgia Tech this year. They got at Wake, at Duke, 2 games that are absolutely winnable. At Boston College, winnable game. Pitt comes to them. So I'll be curious to see how things iron out for Georgia Tech. But it would not surprise me this year if they're a team that's sitting there 8 wins, maybe 9 wins, and depending on what happens elsewhere, maybe they're in the mix for an at-large playoff spot. Team that made the playoff last year, I think has a chance to be back in the mix. That's the SMU Mustangs. Now, last year's schedule was for the most part gettable. This year's going to be a little bit different animal. They bring back a veteran quarterback in Kevin Jennings. I'm very optimistic about his growth. He made a ton of plays last year. But sometimes the fundamentals where he was maybe too deep in the pocket, maybe tried to do a little too much, maybe left the pocket a little too early. Maybe some of those things can be cleaned up. But the playmaking ability has been on display since he took over as the starter there at the midway point last year. I love Coach Rhett Lashley. I love their offense. I think they make it very difficult on the opposing defense. I love their tight end, RJ Maryland, who got hurt at the midway point last year, but he's got a chance to, I think, accelerate to a potential All-American type season. And the defense last year, what was lost is how good they were across the board. They were really strong against the run. They were the best in the ACC last year in rushing yards allowed. They bring back a few pieces from that group, but there is a little bit of turnover on that side of the ball. And then you look at the offensive line. Their offensive line should return mostly intact, and they did a pretty good job of making strategic use of the transfer portal to reinforce some spots that they need to improve. The big thing is, got to be a little consistent with ball security. They did have games last year where they turned it over 6 times. They also have to replace Brashard Smith at running back, which will be very difficult. They have some new receivers that will be difficult to kind of figure out exactly where they're going to be. But SMU should be back in the mix. It's possible, very possible, for them to get back to the ACC championship game. But this year would be an even bigger accomplishment because of who they have to navigate through in order to get back to the ACC title game. They're at Clemson. They have Miami at home. They have Louisville at home. They also play Baylor and at TCU in the non-conference. So that'll be very tricky. They get Stanford at home, at Wake Forest, at Boston College. So you look at their schedule, it is much more challenging than what they were last year. But I still think the personnel is going to have a great understanding of what Rhett Lashley wants of them. And now they have a little better understanding of what it's like to navigate through a Power 5 schedule. So I think the learning curve was experienced last year. Now it gets even more difficult. And guess what? They go from hunter to hunted. You know, everybody's got SMU circled, but they think they're ready to handle the challenge that the ACC will likely present. We'll go next to a team that I think is very, very difficult to prognosticate, and that's the Florida State Seminoles. I still believe, as long as Florida State plays football, I still believe it is within reason that they can get back into the mix of the college football playoff conversation. Now, it's going to look a little different. New quarterback coming in from Thomas Castellanos, but I don't have to tell Florida State fans this. If you watch what Thomas Castellanos did 2 years ago against Florida State while he was at Boston College, he almost single-handedly won that game on the road in Chestnut Hill. He ran for 92 yards on 3rd down alone in that game and kind of led to becoming one of the crazier outcomes of the entire 2023 season. Think about that 2023 Seminole team. They were incredible. So the fact that Thomas Castellanos made quick work of them has to have you feeling pretty confident about what he might be able to do now with the personnel that he'll have around him. He also has a head coach in Mike Norvell and an offensive coordinator in Gus Malzahn that really know how to use athleticism at the quarterback spot. They've been really aggressive in the transfer portal. They go out, they bring 26 new players, including Deuce Robinson from USC, who's long, rangy, and athletic, can win those contested catch situations. They've had big receivers in the past and have had great success with big receivers in the past. They also bring in Squirrel White from Tennessee and 4 experienced offensive linemen. So it's going to be a new looking unit, but you got to feel pretty confident about the improvements they're likely going to make on the offensive side of the football. And then defensively, new defensive coordinator, new scheme, new system, but they do have some pieces that you can absolutely build around, like safety Edwin Joseph, who has a chance to break out this year, and Omar Graham as well, who I think a lot of people are very excited about. So I think if you look at kind of everything along Florida State, they're poised for a massive bounce back from the 2-10 season. Now, tough schedule. You get Alabama in the season opener. You go to Clemson. You have Miami at home. You're at Florida. You're at NC State. So it's a gauntlet of a schedule. But week 1 will tell us all we need to know about what Florida State might be able to accomplish. They can go toe-to-toe in Tallahassee with Alabama, a team that I have great admiration for this season. That might be a sign of things to come for what could be a team that bounces back in a huge way, goes from the outhouse back to the penthouse here in 2025. Moving to Tier 3, these are teams that we would qualify as spoilers. Not teams that I think at this point can make a playoff run. They're not teams that I think at this point can win the ACC, but they are teams that can absolutely knock off a contender within this conference. We'll start with the Pitt Panthers. Look, big part of my optimism around Pitt is what they're likely going to do on the offensive side of the ball. Cade Bell, their offensive coordinator, is back. Year number 2, expect a boost on that side. You also bring back running back Desmond Reed, who is amazing, was so good last year in so many different ways. He's great out of the backfield as a pass catcher. He can run it between the tackles. He can run it on the perimeter. He contributes a little bit in the special teams world. He's a star and has a chance, I think, to take a huge step this upcoming season. They also have a star on the defensive side of the football in Kyle Lewis. Made a ton of plays last year, had over 100 tackles, had nearly 16 tackles for loss, 7 sacks, 4 picks. He's all over the field and has a chance, I think, to be really, really good. They have a veteran secondary, and they also should get a second-year bump from their quarterback, Eli Holstein. While there were flashes last year, there was some inconsistency at times that was had, and he also got a little bit banged up there for a little bit as well. So they haven't necessarily gone as far as to say there's drama at the quarterback spot, but Eli Holstein, expecting him to take a bump this year, and they also need to be better in the fourth quarter. There were a handful of games last year in which they were in the mix in the fourth quarter. They had 6 losses. They actually had the lead or were tied in the fourth quarter in 4 of those 6 losses. So they have to be able to get over that hump and finish games the way they start games this upcoming season. Very difficult schedule. Notre Dame comes to them. That's in the non-conference. They also will play at West Virginia in the backyard brawl. That's early in the season before going to Florida State. Louisville comes to them. NC State comes to them. And Miami comes to them. So the good news is for Pitt is most of their most difficult games will be there in Pitt, where they'll have to have a big crowd on their side against some of that playoff contending potential that they'll see on the other side. The Duke Blue Devils are up next, and there's a lot of buzz after what was a great first season for Manny Diaz. 9-3 in the regular season, a lot to look forward to with this upcoming year, and some momentum that was created with a big splash on the recruiting trail. They went out and they got Darian Mensah from Tulane. He had a great year last year, did a lot of really positive things for Tulane, and now they land a big fish early in the portal cycle when a lot of people are going after Mensah. Duke was able to land him. That was big. They also should be really good on the defensive side. That's Manny Diaz's bread and butter. They bring back pivotal playmakers on the outside and Rivers, safety at Terry Moore, Trey Freeman, a bunch of pieces back that you should feel pretty confident about. They also bring back a talented group of running backs. So you're going to take some of the pressure off of Darian Mensah if for whatever reason there's a little bit of a learning curve as he gets comfortable in a new offense. They have a solid core along the offensive line and at running back to rely on. If you look at their schedule, there's one game in particular that really stands out to me, and that's a game against Illinois. They'll host Illinois early in the season, and that could be massive for not just Duke, but for the entire ACC and potentially the perception of the Big Ten as well. So circle that one. Regardless of who you're rooting for, that game might impact your team regardless of who it is you cheer for on a week-in, week-out basis. They also go to Clemson. They're at Tulane, tough non-conference game. You get NC State, at North Carolina, and at Syracuse. So if you look at Duke, the schedule is not impossible, but there are some challenging games on there as well. They'll host Georgia Tech and a few other games that are absolutely losable, but I would not be surprised if Manny Diaz continued to build on what it was he accomplished in year number 1. Virginia Tech Hokies are next. I think this is a team that can be problematic. The problem is last year we had high hopes and expectations, and they just did not get off to a great start. They bring in a new offensive coordinator in Philip Montgomery, who's been around a long time, dating back to his time at Baylor. He was with RG3 at Baylor, so he's been around the game. He knows the game. He knows how to score points. This new leadership should hopefully bring some new perspective to an offense that at times was very up and down. And Kyron Drones, it's his third year as a starting quarterback. There have been some really positive moments. Down the stretch of 2023, he was playing fantastic. Got to be healthy, naturally, but his running ability allows him to be dynamic. Now it's about being a little bit more methodical, a little better situationally, and if he can take those strides, you got to feel good about what they might be able to do. There are a couple concerns. The offensive line lost all 5 starters from last year. Some by way of transfers, but they did go out. They get the guy from West Virginia and Remax, so maybe that will help. They got to be more consistent at wide receiver. That's been a group that's turned over a lot as well. And if you look too defensively, new coordinator coming in, you got some key returners, but it's a bit of a rebuild because there's only 2 guys that started last year. They're going to be starting again this season. So they've also struggled in one-score games. That's been long documented under Brent Pry. They are 1-11 in one-score games. So that's kind of hurt their win total naturally the last few years. They got to close those close ones if they're going to make a jump here in 25. You get South Carolina neutral site. That's in Atlanta. That's week 1. They're at Florida State. Louisville, Miami, both come to the land of the Hokies. They also go to NC State and to Georgia Tech. So you look at the schedule, it's tough in some spots, but also gettable in some spots, especially if they can pull off a big home upset against one of those top tier teams. The NC State Wolfpack are up next, and I am a believer. Let me just start by saying I called NC State games for years. I've come to know what to expect from NC State. I've come to know what to expect from Dave Dorn. And when I watched last year's version of NC State, it was in some ways unrecognizable, but I think they are about to take a big step forward. This is the big sleeper in the ACC for me this year, and a lot of it hinges on the development of their quarterback, CJ Bailey. Look, he got thrust in as a true freshman last year, and there were a lot of positives. Difficult circumstances, but a lot of positives, and there was some promise showed by Bailey throughout the season. He threw for over 2,400 yards, had 19 total touchdowns, and if you think back, too, with the amount of turnover that NC State has had at quarterback the last few years, man, having the guy returning for a second year as their starting quarterback is not something they've had. It feels like 4 or 5 years in a row. They've had a new guy every year. They've had a guy at least situationally 4 games and he transfers out, all this stuff. So quarterback's been a little bit of a challenge for NC State when traditionally that's been a huge strength. It should be a strength again this year, assuming CJ Bailey takes a big step forward. They also returned 6 of their top 7 receiving leaders from a year ago. And I love Justin Jolie, who is a preseason All-ACC selection at tight end. This guy's big time and has a chance, I think, to have a big year this year. Hollywood Smothers is back at running back. He could have a breakout campaign. And you have a new defensive coordinator, DJ Elliott, who's been around college for a very long time. They get back 7 starters from a year ago, including their leading tackler, Sean Brown, and they've done a pretty good job of going into the portal and maybe not overwhelming their roster from a portal standpoint, but reinforcing spots where they just were a little bit thin kind of across the board. Couple questions. They got a lot of new faces that'll be back there in the secondary. They were very inconsistent last year at times, and they also got to be a lot better along the offensive line. Last year, they just weren't quite as good as we've come to expect from the NC State Wolfpack. I expect that group to collectively be better this year, and they're going to need to be to help CJ Bailey out, assuming he can take a big jump here in year number 2. Tough schedule at Notre Dame. You get Florida State. It comes to you. You're at Miami. You also get Virginia Tech at home. You're at Wake Forest, and you're at Duke. You get North Carolina at home. You get Georgia Tech at home. You look at the schedule, it's not insurmountable. Yes, you look at the game at Notre Dame, that's tough sledding. The game at Miami, very, very tough sledding. But a lot of their other more difficult games are at home. Georgia Tech, East Carolina, Virginia, all these games are going to be played there in Raleigh. So reason to believe a big step could be made by NC State this year, assuming all the pieces fall into place that we're expecting to fall in place. One of the biggest off-season storylines of the entire season has centered around the North Carolina Tar Heels. And I think they are in the spoiler category this year. And once we get to the schedule here in just a minute, they might even be able to do a little more than be just a spoiler in the ACC. The big thing is we don't know. There's so many new faces. There's so much new with Bill Belichick returning to college football, coming to college football for the first time in a million years, okay? 6-time Super Bowl winning head coach. No one is going to doubt what he can do from a strategic standpoint, from an experience standpoint, and the discipline that he's going to instill in that program. He's going to focus on the fundamentals. They're going to do a tremendous job of game planning. They're going to exploit opponent weaknesses. All those things will absolutely be had under Bill Belichick. The problem is, what does this personnel look like? They have endured a complete overhaul on the defensive side of the football. They brought in some key players. They lost some key players. You get his son, Stephen Belichick, who's expected to bring kind of an aggressive and disciplined defensive identity. That's a big question mark. If they can take strides on defense, it should be very intriguing. Look, they also lose some pretty key pieces offensively. Omarion Hampton is gone. That's massive. Okay. He was such a go-to guy at running back the last couple of years, did more with less. They also lose J.J. Jones. They lose Tez Walker. They lose a bunch of guys at wide receiver as well. So they got to make sure they have a guy step up. Maybe it's going to be Kobe Pacer, who was injured all of last year, but is expected to kind of bounce back and be legitimate. The offensive line has a bunch of pieces back that should be helpful. They can kind of lean on that. But the big questions are, how do you replace Omarion Hampton? That's a huge question mark. Who's going to be your quarterback? Last year it was Jacoby Criswell that kind of filled in there down the stretch. You have Gio Lopez, who comes over from South Alabama, had a pretty nice year, threw for over 3,000 yards and 25 touchdowns. You also have Max Johnson, who got hurt in week 1. He's going to be vying for the position as well. And then will there be a bit of a learning curve for Bill Belichick as he gets to college? New offenses, different offensive identities. Will he maybe take a year for him to kind of figure out exactly where things are going to go? So I look at kind of where things are right now for North Carolina. I look at the roster. I'm like, I don't know. Now I look at the schedule. I'm like, okay, they can make some noise. Let's go through this schedule real quick, okay? Season opener, Labor Day night against TCU. This is one of their toughest games of the entire season. Now, TCU last year, they finished 9-4. It wasn't a remarkable season considering what they accomplished just a few years ago, but they should be one of the better programs in the Big 12 this year. That's a massive game. They also have Clemson at home. Clemson's one of the best teams in the sport. They get them there in Chapel Hill. It's massive, and we've seen great Clemson teams go there and play amazing games against North Carolina, and Clemson survived, but that will be a tough spot for Clemson. They also go to Syracuse. They're to NC State. That's a rivalry game. That's a very losable game naturally for North Carolina. And they get Duke at home. Guys, that's about it. So TCU, remarkably difficult. Clemson there in the mid part of the season, remarkably difficult. And then at NC State in the final game of the regular season. They get Duke at home, at Syracuse, Richmond, UCF, at Cal, Stanford's at their place, Virginia's at their place, at Wake Forest. They're playing most of the bottom tier of the ACC. So we could very easily fast forward to the end of the year and think, man, North Carolina's got 2 or 3 losses, which is kind of amazing. They might not have beaten a whole lot of high quality teams, but they might not have very many losses to show for it because they avoid Florida State, they avoid Miami, they avoid Louisville, they avoid SMU. So this might be a team whose record is actually better than the quality of their personnel, but their personnel might actually be pretty good too. We just have too many unknowns. There's too many new faces. So North Carolina is a team that I'm starting to get a little bit more on board with, partly because of their schedule and also partly because of the possibility of those pieces gelling early and becoming very competitive as the season goes along. We'll go next to Tier 4. These are teams that we expect to see in the postseason, but are they really a threat to the top teams in the league? I don't know the answer to that just yet, but I do believe these teams have a chance to be dangerous, but there's still an awful lot of questions around the teams that fit into the Tier 4 category. We will kick it off with the Boston College Eagles. Look, last year was a pretty amazing job by Bill O'Brien, kind of taking the helm. It's his second year. They finished 7-6. They have a tough games kind of throughout the season, but man, there was a lot to kind of build on. Like Bill O'Brien's done a great job throughout the course of his career, whether it's a head coach in the NFL, a head coach in college, whether it's at Penn State or at Boston College. You got to believe that he's going to be even better this year with a better understanding of what his personnel might look like. Their quarterback situation is interesting. Grayson James played pretty well in the 6 starts he got last year, but they add Dylan Lonergan from Alabama, who's pushing hard for that starting job. That competition will continue, but it'll be very interesting to see who ultimately becomes the guy for Boston College this year. They lose Kyle Robichaux, but they have really good, talented backs that should be just fine. They're very talented at wide receiver. They should rebuild along the offensive line. And the defense was kind of the key to their success last year. They were great against the run. They were solid on third down. They have an experienced secondary, but they do have to replace some big-time production on that side of the ball as well. So Boston College, when you look at the schedule, it's hard to envision them getting a lot of these wins, but I do think they'll be competitive in game against Clemson at home, Notre Dame at home, SMU at home. They go to Michigan State, they go to Louisville, they go to Syracuse, they go to Pitt. Georgia Tech comes to them. So I look at Boston College. I think they're going to the postseason, but how much noise can they make? That's a big question mark heading into year number 2 for Bill O'Brien. Syracuse Orange are also, I think, heading to the postseason, but I do not expect another 10-win campaign. Last year was amazing. There's been so much roster turnover, and last year, if you look at their schedule, it was one of the most manageable in the entire country amongst Power 5 teams. Now it becomes one of the more difficult schedules in the entire ACC. Look, Fran Brown did an amazing job, infused energy, infused a winning culture, and the record was reflected. They did a great job, I think, going into the portal, adding LSU transfer Ricky Collins at quarterback. They also added Notre Dame transfer Steve Angeli to have a solid quarterback competition to see who's going to replace the outgoing Kyle McCord, who had an amazing season last year. You got a veteran offensive line. You got a bunch of upperclassmen on the defensive side, even though there's a bunch of new faces on that side of the ball. But, man, there's been so much turnover. They lost so much production. Only 37% of their production is back this year. And on defense, they have just 3 starters that return from 2024. Be very interested to see how this is all going to go, because with rebuilding on defense, with inexperience at quarterback, with some uncertainty in the kicking game, there's reason to believe that Syracuse could come back to the pack just a little bit. And the non-conference game early against Tennessee is going to teach us a lot. They'll play Tennessee week 1. We'll learn a lot about both Tennessee and Syracuse. Both teams have massive question marks going into the season, but Tennessee, a lot more known commodities than Syracuse at this point. They'll also go to Clemson. They'll go to SMU. They'll go to Miami. 3 of the best teams in the ACC, they're on the road at all 3. Not to mention another non-conference game on the road at Notre Dame. Very, very difficult schedule for Syracuse this season. They do host North Carolina. They do host Duke. But for the most part, man, I think this is the most difficult schedule in the ACC. Went from being very manageable last year. They're rewarded with 10 wins. This year, it's a huge ramp up. Vegas reflects that with just a 5.5 season win total. Man, it's hard for me right now to take the under, knowing how good they were a year ago, but there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of things to iron out here in year number 2 for Fran Brown. The Virginia Cavaliers are next, and there's kind of hope that a breakthrough year could be coming. They missed a bowl game the first 3 seasons. There's a strong sense this is a big year for Tony Elliott, the head coach. Do feel really confident about their quarterback addition in Chandler Morris. Look, he's played a lot of football, has been at a bunch of different places. He's a dual threat, so he can run the football, he can keep plays alive, and with his experience, that should help stabilize the offensive side of the football. You look at the defense and their defensive line in particular, man, they've completely overhauled the defensive line, bringing in transfers from Alabama, Fresno, Ohio State, UNLV, Elon, a bunch of new faces there up front defensively. And then the back end, they do have some experienced safety depth and strong linebackers. But for the most part, man, there are some unknowns there in the front along the defensive line. Overall, this should be an improved group. The offensive line's got some veteran leadership, and the schedule is pretty manageable. That's big, especially when you're a team that's hoping to break through and get to the postseason. They host Florida State. They're at Louisville. They're at NC State. They're at North Carolina. 4 very difficult games. 3 of those 4 are on the road, but they do host Virginia Tech, and they avoid Clemson. They avoid Miami. They avoid SMU. That's massive. They also avoid Georgia Tech. So I think getting to a bowl game is the bare minimum expectation for Virginia this year, but how many can they get? Because they got to win the games they're supposed to get. If they can get those games at home, got to feel pretty good about what Tony Elliott might be able to do this year. We'll go next to tier number 5, and these are teams with work to do. I want to see everybody in the postseason, but it's hard for me to envision these 3 teams playing in the postseason this year. There's just too many unknowns. We'll start with the Cal Bears. Look, a lot of uncertainty here in 2025. They've had a massive roster exodus here over the last couple months. You do have great leadership at the top with Ron Rivera. He's not the head coach, but he's helping Justin Wilcox, who's in his 9th year, kind of piece together a roster. You also bring in offensive coordinator Brian Harsin, who I think is very, very good. He was former head coach at Auburn, former head coach at Boise State, has spent a lot of time as the offensive coordinator. He's got great experience, but he's got a lot of unknowns within his roster. They should be really good along the defensive line. That's a great starting point. But with all the pieces that they brought in with the portal, it's going to be hard to kind of figure out exactly who goes where. They have 36 new players to replenish a roster that saw a ton of guys go elsewhere and become starters in other places. Some of the challenges, we don't know exactly what the quarterback situation is going to look like. Is it going to be Devin Brown, the Ohio State transfer? He's the guy. They also have a decorated true freshman. We'll see exactly what that situation looks like. Can they create continuity and replace Fernando Mendoza from a year ago? Can they replace their top two running backs? Jaden Ott goes to Oklahoma. Can they replace all their wide receivers that were lost? All 5 starting defensive backs, 3 of whom were drafted into the NFL. That was the strength of their team last year. Can they rebuild that secondary? Can they rebuild the offensive line? Even though they have transfers, can they rebuild it to the point where they were a year ago? It's hard for me to envision that right now. I look at the schedule: at Oregon State, Minnesota in the non-conference, at Louisville, SMU, at Virginia Tech, North Carolina. They do avoid Clemson, Florida State, Miami, Syracuse, and NC State. So it is certainly reasonable to think that they could get to the postseason. Right now, there's just too many unknowns around Cal's roster to feel great about them getting to 6 wins this season. We'll go next to the Stanford Cardinal. They've had 4 consecutive 3-9 campaigns. New coaching change. Program's in a complete rebuild. But there are some changes that have me feeling a little optimistic. I love the interim head coach, Frank Wright. After Troy Taylor's departure, you have a former NFL head coach, an experienced head coach that's going to take over in the interim role here in 2025. Got some NFL experience that should be helpful, but you don't even know yet who your quarterback is going to be. Is it going to be redshirt freshman Elijah Brown, former 4-star recruit? Got to feel decent about possibility of that. Is it going to be Dylan Rizek from UCF who transferred over? You got a bunch of transfer portal additions at wide receiver. That's a big question mark. You do have a great piece at tight end in Sam Roush. He should be one of the breakout players in the conference, one of the best ACC tight ends this year. But the roster turnover, the struggles they've had along the offensive line, some of the weaknesses we've seen on defense the last couple of years. They were second worst in the FBS last year in yards allowed. They gave up 462 yards a game. They gave up nearly 38 points per game. The pass defense was really bad. They were 131st nationally, and they just haven't been consistent at any point in the last few years. So it's hard for me to envision them getting to 6 wins. They host Notre Dame. They also have Florida State that comes to them. They're at Miami. They're at SMU. They're at BYU. They're at Hawaii. They're at North Carolina. You notice how many games that I just listed that we're at Miami, SMU, BYU, Hawaii. Those are big challenges to go on the road to those places, and especially to Hawaii, where it's a tricky spot. Now, Hawaii's not a top-tier team, but a season opener across the Pacific could be a little disruptive to everything they're trying to accomplish throughout the course of the season. Boston College comes to them. They're at Virginia. Right now, I think the schedule is just too tough for Stanford to carve out their place in the postseason out of the ACC. Finally, it's the Wake Forest Demon Deacons. They are entering into a new era. Jake Dickert comes over after spending the last 11 years with Dave Clawson. Wake Forest has a new leader in charge, brand new coaching staff. Dickert did an amazing job at Washington State, brings a bit of a new philosophy to Wake Forest. Should be pretty good with what he's done defensively, but there's also, I think, a willingness to allow his offense to go and do it. They bring in offensive coordinator Rob Ezel, who was at South Alabama the last year. They were 18th best in scoring offense in 2024. So Ezel is going to implement a tempo-based, aggressive offensive scheme that kind of gets away from Wake Forest's slow mesh scheme that they've used the last few years. Got a new defensive coordinator, Scotty Hazelton, who's been around a lot. He's been at Michigan State. He's been at Texas. He's been kind of all over the place. And their weakness last year in the defense was in the back end. They're going to have a system that will hopefully be digestible and hopefully be in a position to potentially get some stops in the ACC. They do have a workhorse running back in Demond Claiborne, should be helpful. Crucial piece of the offense, had a 1,000-yard season a year ago, so he's going to be impactful. New quarterback competition. We'll see exactly where it goes. It could be Robbie Ashford, who's played at both Oregon, Auburn, and South Carolina. Is it going to be Deshaun Purdy from Charlotte? Not sure exactly what it's going to be, but they're going to have athleticism at the quarterback spot, and they need to get some significant help along the offensive line. The defensive front seven's completely reloaded. They feel pretty good about some of the pieces they brought in there, but there's just been so much roster turnover along the defensive line, so much roster turnover at wide receiver. It's going to be hard right now to envision exactly what it is they're going to be. So it's going to take some time For this new scheme to take shape, it's going to take time to figure out exactly who the quarterback's going to be, and the schedule doesn't allow them a lot of time to get things going in the right direction. They're at Florida State, SMU comes to them, NC State comes to them, at Virginia Tech, at Oregon State, and then they play against Georgia Tech at home. They do avoid Clemson, Miami, Louisville, and Syracuse, but still, it's very, very difficult. The non-conference schedule is quite light. All right, so you get Kennesaw State, Western Carolina, and Delaware. All three of those teams are in the FCS, so you could stack 3 wins there, but now you got to go get 3 in the ACC. That's difficult for me to envision at this point. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. Continue to encourage all of you guys to continue to subscribe to the podcast wherever it is you get the podcast. We're always grateful to those of you that contribute there. Our ratings have been sabotaged in the past. You guys can help us get back on track by adding a 5-star rating if you so choose. No need, no pressure. We just appreciate that you guys are here and wanted to talk college football at the end of July. Lots to look forward to here in the ACC. I think the league is very, very strong. I really do. I think the league is deeper than it's been in quite some time, but I do think those 2 teams at the top, Clemson and Miami, they can make a legitimate run and potentially bring home an elusive national championship for the first time since 2018. So for all of us here at Always College Football, for Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. We hope you have an amazing day, and remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.